Hey, welcome you all. My name is Kong. I'm the Executive Director at Jobs with Justice San Francisco. I'm really excited to bring you in today to our webinar, Power is at the Root. And, just the first off, we want this to be accessible. So closed captioning will be provided in this webinar. To access it, we'll be dropping a link in the comments. So if you want live closed captioning, please go to that link and click on it. Power is at the root. I mean, if you believe that power is at the root, if you're with us today on this webinar, just, jump in the comments, say, hey, say what's up, add your thoughts to this meeting. And first off, I just want to acknowledge, we have Luis from Working Partnerships. We have many friends joining us today from the South Bay and from the labor movement, and to acknowledge the heaviness and the sorrow and the pain that many of folks are still feeling today, and of our siblings in the South Bay and the public transit workers. We'll be showing a link in a sec because you can support them. There's different ways to support. Here's a fund to support the victims and the families of what happened at the VTA. There's also a vigil tonight at San Jose City Hall. So you can join people there as well. And, not only, is this something that many of us are feeling right now, what many of us are bringing to the space, but it's also really relevant to what we're talking about today. Yesterday, I was listening to a fast food worker give testimony, and she spoke about feeling like she had to go to work. She had to make a living. And yet, at the same time, every day she was going in, she knew that she was risking getting COVID, taking that back to her family, exposing everyone else around her. And so, for me, whether we're going to work as a fast food worker, as a transit worker, as a warehouse worker, we're going to work to live, right? Not to run the risk of being killed, not to be injured, not to be exposed to dangerous conditions. And we have so much work to do together for safety in our society, for workers, for Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And we have so much more to do in the workplace. And we're not just wanting to be safe, right? But we want to be whole. We want to have dignity. And so today we're talking about a future of work. And this is the kind of future of work we're talking about, not just about robots or technological change. We're talking about a visionary future of work, our vision for a future of work. And this status quo where workers are dying at work, where their dignity dies at work, this is unacceptable, and it's also not inevitable. We can make different choices. And to do that, we have to understand that power is at the root, power to make choices. And this is what we're talking about today. I'm so excited to bring this report to you all today, and for our speakers to be sharing their thoughts about what does it mean for power to be at the root. We want you to share your thoughts too. You can participate in this conversation. We make this road together, so please join us. You can share this over the live stream, drop in your comments, right? So we can do this together. I'm gonna bring in Rob from ReWork. He's gonna bring in the rest of the team as well. Rob.
Thank you, Kung. And as Kung said, I'm Rob Hope with ReWork the Bay. And for those of you who don't know us, ReWork the Bay brings together leaders in philanthropy, workforce development, worker organizing, and small business to advance collective solutions for a diverse and equitable Bay Area. Power is at the Root is the culmination of a project that ReWork the Bay commissioned in 2019 because we felt that the conversation around the future of work was really one-sided. It was largely driven by the corporate perspective, and it was also focused almost entirely on automation as the central aspect of how work is and will be changing. Because one of our core values at ReWork the Bay is centering workers, we wanted to better understand the worker perspective on the future of work and how philanthropy, workforce, and private sector leaders could help shape our future to be one where work meets our societal needs, where all people can achieve their full potential and agency, and where the value created by work is shared by all. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to the project team. You already heard from Kong Feng of Jobs with Justice San Francisco. He'll be rejoining us later in the program. Also from Jobs with Justice, we have Davida Sotelo Escobedo. Our other ReWork the Bay team member is Kyla Tolentino. And from Working Partnerships USA, while she isn't with us, to be remiss not to acknowledge the work of Priscilla Acuna Mena, who was a key part of this team prior to leaving her role recently to go back to school. And finally, I'd like to introduce Louise Arhan, also from Working Partnerships USA, who will be framing today's discussion. Louise?
Great, thank you, Rob. So to kick off, I'm going to briefly introduce you to our top-line findings, and then we'll dive more into what each of these really means on the ground. So over the past 2 years, we've scanned over 100 Bay Area initiatives responding to the changing aspects of work, interviewed dozens of progressive leaders, worker advocates, and grassroots organizations, including many of you all who are joining us today. So thank you very much for your time and insight. And we dove deep to ask you all workers and community leaders, what are the key future of work issues that we collectively need to tackle? And what roles can and should philanthropy and workforce development be playing? And what we heard is that we need new ways to think about the future of work, using a framework that centers the worker perspective and prioritizes racial justice and economic equity. And those recommendations can be distilled into 5 top lines, which you see here. They are forge a racially just future, center workers as decision makers, focus on the changes that are most affecting people's lives, shape technology to serve people, and at the root of it all, build collective power. So today, I'm excited to be joined by leaders from across sectors to speak about how these findings relate to their work on the ground. What are the implications for the futures of economic justice work, of workforce development, and of philanthropy? To tackle those questions, our first guest brings with him over 2 decades of experience in some of the most challenging industry environments. Shahryar Kaushji is the co-founder and executive director of the Warehouse Worker Resource Center. He spent 20 years developing research, policy, campaign strategies to support the most marginalized communities in California, including families facing displacement in San Francisco, farm workers in the valleys, truck drivers in Los Angeles, and for the past 10 years, communities affected by the massive warehousing and logistics sector of the Inland Empire. There, he's been spearheading an innovative model to organize workers in the supply chains of the largest companies in the world. He has a master's in public policy from UCLA and a BA from our own local Santa Cruz. So Shahryar, welcome.
Thank you so much. So what I wanted to speak to was our own experience in the warehouse sector, which is the dominant sector of the Inland Empire, but also something that's really becoming a dominant sector of the California economy, and I think a really exemplary one for all of us, how that's played out. The thing that you should know about warehousing is that it contains both the worst conditions in some of these workplaces, in terms of workers working through staffing agencies, working under really contingent situations, have to call in every day to find out if you have work. If you can't keep up with your quota, you can lose your job. But also some of the most capitalized and profitable companies, including Amazon, controlling that work. That dynamic, I think, is not an accident. I think that is, the future of work if we don't do something about it. Highly technologized companies taking advantage of workers and trying to squeeze every penny out of them, and utilizing the capital that they're getting from investors to try to do that. So the story that I want to tell, and then Yesenia, one of our organizers who has worked in warehouses more recently, will speak more deeply, is that the future of work is contested. And the fact is that employers like Amazon and a lot of these companies are taking advantage of these technologies to try to make it harder for people to be able to organize, trying to make it harder for people to have consistent work. And that is the benefit of some of these new innovations. So an example is the pace of work. Workers have always had production standards in all kinds of different workplaces, but in a lot of workplaces led by companies like Amazon, now surveillance, algorithmic management, and tracking has led to workers being in situations where they are always being watched, and they always feel like they have to keep up. What that leads to is these workers who are already very contingent having to, basically feel like they're always being watched and they can't take a break, they can't slow down. That leads to workers either burning out, really, really high turnover, but also injury rates that are very high. These destabilize our communities, but in turn, again, make it harder for workers to get together. Why is that a problem? Workers getting together and organizing in their communities, but also in their workplaces, has always been a key part of how power is built and how corporate power especially is challenged. There's nothing more powerful than workers getting together in their workplace to take direct action, whether they have a union or not. What our efforts have been over the years is to bring together workers who at this point don't have a union to take collective action to slow down their workplace, to make sure that their injuries are taken into consideration, to recapture lost wages. Those kinds of contexts are the things that, again, the future of work is being framed as a way to speed things up, to make more money. At the end of the day, organizing is losing out, and if we don't find ways to actually take advantage of and slow down things, that's going to make it harder for workers to organize, and power will continue to be lost. Another aspect of the future of work that I want to speak to is technologization and the transition to climate and climate resiliency. Goods movement in our sector is a highly unsustainable model. It's based in use of diesel, based in use of fossil fuels. Transportation is the biggest polluter and creator of greenhouse gases in California and the country. And as the transition is happening, hopefully in California, other places, to being sustainable, again, what we're seeing is that employers, if we don't organize, are going to utilize this transition to benefit themselves rather than the workers who are doing the work. Our workers who work in our communities, who are working class people who try to use a warehouse job or a trucking job to sustain themselves, are based in a place where they need these jobs, and now these jobs are transitioning to be more technologized, to be more based in green technology, that kind of thing. We're seeing is we need to make sure that there's a pathway for those folks into these new jobs, both because those are the jobs of the future, but also because those are jobs that represent an opportunity for a career. So again, like, the future of work is a lot of different things, but for us, what it means is centering communities of color, centering working class people, Black people, Latinx people, who are the people we depend on for our goods movement, we depend on for our production, and making sure that these changes are actually done in a way that they benefit our communities. How do you do that? Again, we have to organize. Capital is organizing. These employers are figuring out ways to take advantage of and accelerate their improvements for their own benefit. What we need to do is make sure that workers have a voice in their workplaces and the ability to speak up, whether it's a traditional collective bargaining agreement or other worker organization, where they can speak up and say, this is what we think is safe for our community, this is what we think is appropriate for our workplace. So that's really kind of our analysis. And I think the last thing I'll say before I pass it on to Yesenia is, this is the sector where we're seeing a lot of these trends. Whatever sector you're working in, it's coming. This is coming into white collar sectors. This is coming to the gig sector, of course, retail. These changes that are happening have been happening very quickly in warehousing. And if we don't have a plan, this is going to come to the rest of the economy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yesenia, you're all set.
Oh, okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yesenia Barrera, and I'm an organizer with the Warehouse Workers Resource Center. I also do live in the Inland Empire, where Amazon does have a massive presence in our communities. As a former Amazon worker myself, I can say that, the work is actually very physically demanding, and it's mentally straining. And it's very, harsh on the body, especially when workers are constantly, and repetitively bending, reaching, twisting, and pulling, items that are from 30 pounds to 60 pounds each day for about 8 to 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. That's not including like mandatory overtime, where, these workers aren't allowed to use any of like their personal time or vacation days. So all that work, that's where these injuries mainly start, to happen. And I can say that at least every worker there does 15 to 20 miles of walking just throughout their whole shifts. And we don't really get like the workers don't really get the proper rest time in between, working repetitively and then heading to the break when the nearest restrooms or the nearest break room is about a 5 to 7 minute walk. And, right now, Amazon workers are, or they have been getting injured, at alarming rates. And it's actually 3 times more than any private employer nationally. And, this is due to the monitoring system and, like abusive work rate quotas that make, workers work even faster to keep up with their rate, for the day. Lots of workers like myself have been, terminated due to the algorithm. Doesn't matter how fast you work or how hard you work, you can still be terminated, even without any human interaction. Amazon does have heavy monitoring systems and surveillance that does keep track of every worker's production, how many items they can pack per second, per minute, and does inform your managers when you haven't even been moving or scanning a box for a couple of minutes. Any time that you spent not on an item, is the time is used against you as a time off task. At the end of your day, any of that time accumulated gets determined by your manager, if you get written up or if you get let go at the end of your shift. This does make a lot of the workers want to work faster, but it's all at the cost of, their bodies. There's very high percentages of injuries, starting with the back, the shoulders, wrists, hands, the knees, and those are all sprains, strains, tears, and bruising because of the repetitive movements of the daily job and then the work speed that they're made to keep up with for their shift. Technology is actually making it worse by pinpointing those workers to be made to keep up with that work, or if they can't keep up, they do get terminated. And that's stressful on a lot of workers. Imagine that mentally. 50 to 60 hours a week. Showing up every day to work, your hardest on the job for several hours, but can still get fired because of the speed. Many workers, like including myself, feel the stress of having to work faster or even ignore personal needs, such as like restroom or even drinking water because no one wants to chance getting written up or even being terminated for it, to not accumulate that, what they call time off tasks. We are not robots, we're human. We could only go so fast. But workers, they have the power to change lots of unsafe conditions, inside of these warehouses. If these workers had a voice, they would be able to speak on up on a lot of things. They can say what's too fast, or speak up on any, health and safety regulations. But right now, they don't really feel as if they have much of a say at work, and they can just end up working at whatever speed just to meet production for Amazon. Also, as an organizer, I can tell you that many of these workers will not be at Amazon, from 3 to 6 months at a time, because, the work, hearing from workers, the work is very physically demanding. It's mentally stressful, and they feel like they were treated poorly or have left because of Amazon. They don't feel like Amazon's ever going to change, their poor working conditions. If these workers were organized, they would have a voice to change these conditions inside. And if we don't, these conditions are never going to improve, inside of these warehousing facilities. Organizing would mean that workers would be able to stay safe and set some standard, right? From, to speaking up for arbitrary and abusive quota systems that's making them work faster and getting injured because of the high demand and online orders. But it would also mean that, workers are able to keep their jobs and being able to provide, for their families. They wouldn't be marked for time as task when complying to health and safety regulations. And workers would just overall have a little more security in the workplace. I know that, there's still a lot of work to be done, but, all of this can still be done if we can work together. Thank you for your time.
And thank you, Yesenia, for sharing such a powerful experience with us. And thank you for all of the organizing work that you've done and continue to do to try to help your fellow workers improve conditions. So next, Davida and I are going to spend a few minutes summarizing the project. Now, what we can cover today in an hour is just the top line. So I really encourage everyone, page through the report. You'll see many more detailed recommendations, examples, quotes that come out of all of the collective wisdom and experience and insight that the project participants so generously shared. So through this project, through the changing nature of work, we sought to shift how Bay Area institutions are approaching the future of work. When we started this in 2019, initially we dug into all the reports and the conversations that were happening at that time around the future of work. And then to go on the ground, we identified over 100 Bay Area initiatives from community, labor, business, government, and workforce that were actually on the ground, responding to the changing aspects of work. So we found that that discourse, the consultant reports, the headlines, the TED Talks, those didn't really match up with what was actually happening, with the changes that people were experiencing, or with the models they were developing to respond. Now, when we first started this project, our own tendency was to put technology at the front, to frame the question as, how is technology affecting workers? But as we dug deeper, we heard that that's not how workers or employers or communities were really experiencing change. By itself, technology doesn't do anything. It just sits there. People do things. So we backed up a step and we said, okay, let's understand what are the changes that people are experiencing in the workplace, in the labor market, in the regional economy, and what are they doing to respond to and to shape that change? And once we shifted our lens to focus on working people's lived experiences, we heard that new technology and automation, while it was certainly on the list, was not the biggest change that was affecting most people's jobs. Some of those changes, the expansion of contingent work, outsourcing, subcontracting, misclassification was much bigger. Climate change, wildfires, droughts, what it means to workers when we're trying to change our source of energy and our land use patterns, that many things loomed much larger than automation. So tech certainly has a role to play, is a tool that is used to enact change, but it has a supporting role. It isn't the main actor. People are the main actor. But then in the middle of this work, the world was hit by COVID. The pandemic forcefully brought home both the importance of essential workers to our whole society. Technology couldn't replace those essential workers, but also brought home how little protection, self-determination, or basic respect society affords those workers, especially for workers of color and for women. And so with that understanding, what are the shifts in perspective that we need for how we get to solutions? So that's where our final report, Powers at the Root, lays out those 5 top-line solutions. And this is the first one, center workers as decision makers. This means we want to take the lead from workers who are defining the problems and developing their own solutions related to future of work. And we want to analyze issues by centering the lived experience of workers along those intersections of race, class, and gender, while relating to workers as leaders and decision makers, not objects of study. And that's really key. There are lots of initiatives that have worker surveys or input or data. That's very important. It's not the same as actually engaging the workers as leaders. And we heard that again and again. Next slide. Can we move to the next slide, please? Oh, yeah, thanks. So recommendation 2 was forge a racially just future as essential to building worker power. So first, we need to understand what are the ongoing effects of systemic racism that underlie our economic and social structures. Next, in our work, prioritize marginalized groups and set high goals. Finally, respect the jobs and the work that are being done right now, every day, by people of color and women as valuable work. Don't dismiss unpaid work, domestic work, farm work, care work, work in the informal economy. That is all work that is and should be equally valued and respected. And if it's not now, how do we find a way to make it so? Next slide, please. Our third recommendation is build collective power. Envision a future of work that rebuilds the power of workers from what has been lost. Support working people and communities of color in organizing for change. Act as an ally to working people who are organizing collectively, and at all scales, prioritize approaches that build that collective power. Next slide, please. So many of our interviews outlined really starkly how power, or the lack of power, plays out in people's lives. So here's one of them. This is about a restaurant worker named Paz and what happened when she got sick. Paz was still in the hospital. One of her places of employment had run out of sick days and the other refused to give them to her. The boss from KFC told her over the phone that he wasn't able to give her any more sick days, but he could give her a chicken sandwich. That's not a skills and education problem. That's a power problem. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and then the fourth recommendation, which should be pretty straightforward, right, is as Louise laid out, is like really focus on the changes that are really, affecting people's lives, and not just, think about it's just automation, but that's just one of just several other big long-term shifts in how work is being organized and like how work and employee dynamics are being affected. And so the ones we laid out really in the report was like one, the expansion of contingent and non-standard work arrangements, because especially this one, like those new regimes are really pushing increasingly larger segments of the workforce into outsource and subcontracted jobs in a way that's really institutionalizing economic insecurity and really institutionalizing workers' lack of control over their time. The recent example being Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, attempts to rewrite labor law and increase their own corporate control, right? And the next ones being, the changing demands for skills, the growth and decline of industries, and then also really highlighted just economic shifts that are resulting from climate change, and both, that being both opportunities around just transition and building in more resilience. Because, these changes, again, aren't something on a distant horizon, people are already being affected by climate change. And it's really shifting away from the question of what jobs are going to be lost and asking the more compelling follow-up of how can we really be investing in confronting the challenges of climate change, which industries have the potential to grow, and how can we make sure we're creating good jobs for those who've been historically excluded. And can you switch to the next slide? And then, the fifth and final top line recommendation was, shaping technology to serve people. And the two parts that being, advocating for choices that prioritize people in the design and deployment of technologies, because as Louise already mentioned, the fundamental problem isn't technology itself, but the way it's being deployed. Because as Yesenia shared earlier, and thank you again for sharing, Yesenia, your story, technology can have a really physical impact on people's bodies and their psyches. And the first step in changing that dynamic is really recognize and being honest that those are choices that individuals, that businesses and societies are making. Because robots don't force people to make work at breakneck speeds. Human beings make the decisions to control workers in that way. And the second component to this is also being just center workers' experience and their expertise to inform how technology is being used. Because workers know better than anyone else the nature of that disruption, and something that's going to vary across industries and workplaces. And because again, at a micro scale, technology isn't eliminating the need for human labor; it's just being used to reorganize the workforce. Can we go to the last slide or next slide? And just to close out this report finding section, which is just a really awesome quote from one of our leaders in the field, Shasan Liu, the ED at Chinese Progressive Association, that really, gets to the heart of all this. And as you see, even inspired the title of our report. And it's power is at the root, choices are being made by people with power, and the status quo is the outcome of people's choices, not the inevitable or natural result of technological innovation. So again, as you can see in all these recommendations, it all comes back to the question of power and really recognizing the importance of agency in this conversation. Is technology being deployed to increase worker agency, or is it being deployed to increase control over workers? And who is actually deploying technology and for what purpose? And with that, we'll hang it back to our awesome MC.
Hey, y'all. Thank you, Davida. Thank you, Luis. I'll take this moment on live stream just to say what a wonderful team, and so much appreciation for working together. This report was really a product of collective work, right, and touched the hands of so many. And also for people here listening to us, you're in it with us. We aren't in a room together, but we can still be together. So keep those comments coming. If you're feeling something, say, oh yes, say, all right, just drop that in the chat. And as we're talking, the report is collective work. It's also built on the work of leaders in the field, like people like Shahryar and Yesenia. And I'm also honored to bring in another leader from the field, Tim Rainey. Tim Rainey is the executive director of the California Workforce Development Board, which is dedicated to the continuous improvement of our state's workforce development system. He also comes from directing the workforce program at the California Labor Federation and brokering training partnerships between unions, employers, community organizations, education, and public workforce agencies. So much respect to that work. Tim, please join us for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Kung. I hope everybody can hear me okay. When we think of, well, first I want to endorse the findings and the recommendations of Power is at the Root. It's a terrific report, and I'm amazed at how quickly you got so much across to the audience. It's really is important work, and I hope people pay attention. When we think about worker voice and agency at the State Workforce Development Board, it's in the context of industry sector partnerships, of workers having a seat at the table in the decisions that impact them and their families, decisions that shape the future of work. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu, as my grandfather used to say. As part of our high road agenda at the State Board, which is focused on quality jobs, equity, and climate resilience, worker voice is at the center. And that's for several reasons, in addition to what has already been said. Try not to be repetitive here. If you're diving deep in sector work to identify gaps, you have to talk to the folks on the front lines. They often know best how things work, how things can work better, and how to create greater efficiencies. If you include workers in the decisions that impact their lives, it reduces their anxiety about the future of work and their place in the future of work. Companies that value worker voice in the design of work and in the design of workforce training, those are the ones that demonstrate that they view workers not as costs to be reduced, but as assets to invest in. And those are the companies that we want to invest in. Those are the companies that the state wants to invest in. And collective bargaining. We target at the State Workforce Board, we're very deliberate about targeting those companies and those industry sectors that have collective bargaining, because that's been the mechanism for worker voice that historically has proven to improve wages and working conditions and worker power, and a seat at the table that's not just a ceremonial seat, but one that has decision-making authority, collective bargaining. Our end game at the State Workforce Board, on behalf of Governor Newsom, is to move the needle significantly on equity in the state of California. And how do you do this? I think first, and I need to preface everything I say before I talk about moving the needle on equity, is you can't achieve equity without paying close attention to job quality, because these things are inextricably linked. As Martin Luther King said, you can't achieve social and racial justice without economic justice. When we looked at data on the workforce system and on program enrollments, we found equity. People from economically disadvantaged groups are well represented in workforce programs in California. Clearly, though, that's not translating into equity in terms of economic outcomes. People of color and women earn less. We know this. Are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed, have less wealth, even with the same educational attainment as their white male counterparts. So education and training alone is not going to solve the challenge that we're trying to solve, because the problem is broken labor markets and institutionalized racism and sexism. To move the needle on equity, we made a conscious decision at the State Workforce Development Board to be interventionist, to go into industry sectors and change the way sectors, multiple companies in those sectors, recruit, hire, and retain workers. We call these high road training partnerships. We start with the best quality jobs in industry sectors that are driving regional employment, and we develop industry-based partnerships that are committed to quality jobs, equity, and worker voice. These partnerships include high road employers, the best employers, labor organizations, community organizations, and workforce. And once we create the conditions for workforce training and recruiting new hires, we then pull from workforce programs from around the state to get at that equity. So our aim in terms of the workforce system is really to shift it toward the high road. And I'm a huge fan of local workforce development boards, and I hope you guys are too. They're all over your region, but also all across the state. And many of these are playing a central role in high road partnerships. I'm also a fan of labor management partnerships. These are born out of collective bargaining. And if you're looking to build high road training partnerships or hitch your wagon to high road training partnerships, that's your low hanging fruit. Go after the labor management partnerships, and they're in many sectors across the state. I want to add here that Don Howard, CEO of the Irvine Foundation, said recently at our High Road Summit that High Road is made for this political moment, and I think it is. Senator Durazo, just yesterday from her budget subcommittee, said that High Road will shape the way our state looks 10, 20, 50 years from now. And that's because we're scaling this work up around the state. Governor Newsom built in a sizable investment in scaling up high road training partnerships around the state and high road construction careers. And the more we do this, the more sectors we can transition, we'll have that kind of impact over time. I think I just want to quickly conclude with maybe a couple of our successes in the approach we've taken, and maybe some of the challenges, if I can very quickly. I know we're limited on time. We invested in the high road training partnership model in several industry sectors over the last several years: hospitality, building services, transit, water utilities, trade and logistics. We invested in the Warehouse Workers Resource Center in the Inland Empire. In fact, healthcare, public sector, construction. UCLA recently released an evaluation, which is on our website. Please go to there, cwdb.ca.org. Maybe we can stick that in the chat. There are also a lot of other materials there on how we build and support high road training partnerships. 3 quick challenges. Holding these partnerships together takes a lot of care and feeding. It requires people with unique skills to set common goals among diverse partners and then manage conflict while guiding partners to those common goals. I think building and sustaining that core organizational structure is at the center. We're at the center is critical, because that's kind of the centripetal force that holds everything together. And then setting these partnerships up for the long game, so that they're not one and done. It's not an investment, and that program work is done, and you go on to whatever work you were doing. It's constant investment, but achieving industry investment over time. So it's not the government driving this as much as industry investing in high road training partnerships and training and building equity and job quality across sectors. And then moving the workforce system in this direction, which I see more as an opportunity than I think a challenge. I think I should probably end there, because I am running out of time. I'll hand it back to Kung. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks very much. I know there was a comment and a question in the feed that was asking, who are these recommendations for? Who is needed to act on them and drive through? Perfect question. These recommendations in this report was targeted towards workforce development practitioners, people who come out of the field that Tim is coming out of. And for our next speaker, Fred Blackwell, like also funders and people in the world of philanthropy. That's who we're speaking to. And it was really a process of interviewing worker leaders on the ground, taking the insights of worker organizations, and then using that to lead to this conversation with workforce development practitioners and funders. And we feel like the collaboration of those fields and an alignment between those fields is what's needed to drive through these recommendations. Leaders from the Future of Work Commission actually called for this multi-stakeholder process between businesses, industry associations, workers, worker organizations, educational institutions, nonprofits, philanthropy, government agencies. And so we see there is this push towards a broad, multi-sector, multi-stakeholder process. And at the heart of it, for us, in this report is that leadership also has to come, that workers have to have collective power to truly make that a collective process. And so this is sort of the push in our process and in our report and in our conversation today. So I want to get to another person that we see and respect so much, Fred Blackwell. He is an Oakland native. Say hey for the town. My son is also an Oakland native. And he is the CEO of the San Francisco Foundation, one of the largest community foundations in the country. And since joining the foundation in 2014, Fred has led it with a renewed commitment to social justice through an equity agenda focused on racial and economic inclusion. And I feel like that's such an important thing to be bringing together. Fred?
Thank you, Kung. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. I'm Fred Blackwell, as he said, CEO of the San Francisco Foundation. We're a community foundation that serves the Bay Area, and we do so with a North Star that is really squarely focused in on achieving a greater degree of racial equity and economic inclusion in the region. This is a very exciting report for me, and wanted to talk about a few things. One is kind of make the connection between racial justice and worker justice. Wanted to maybe highlight some of the challenges that the funding community often has in supporting the power building work that is necessary in order for us to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Offer my unsolicited 2 cents on what funders should be thinking about as they move into this work, and then kind of conclude with some reflections on the moment as we are thinking about economic recovery coming out of COVID. And just to go back to the top around the relationship between racial justice and worker justice, I think these issues are inextricably linked. And there are three ways that I think about it. One is just in the demographics of the workforce and how it's segmented. Second is around the political and civic discourse that kind of sets the stage or tone for conversations about a more just workforce system. And then some of the origins, frankly, and kind of some of the conditions and climate that we describe. First on demographics, I don't think I have to tell this audience anything when I say that when you look at the demographics of folks who are in positions that are often subjected to unjust treatment, they're not all people of color, but they're mostly people of color and disproportionately people of color. And so when you look at the demographics of the workforce and the folks who are looking for the kind of power and agency to create the kind of conditions that are referenced in this report, it's really important for us to think about that in terms of the demographics of the workforce and be responsive to it. Second, and probably equally important, is that, we've all seen what the public discourse and the policy and public discussion looks like and how it's racialized or even politicized around racial lines. And I'm not going to run through all the examples of it, but I'll run through a couple that I think are prevalent in the discourse and undermine what we're trying to achieve. One is like when we think about and hear the discourse around, AAPI communities, we often see the projection, no matter how long or how many generations folks have been living in the Bay Area or living in this country, the projection of the foreigner status, and then the use of that foreigner status as a division or a dividing tool or a wedge around who's worthy, whose jobs are being taken, who's getting what kinds of opportunities. We see the same thing when it comes to immigration status and Latinx communities, and the othering of those communities and the framing of the discourse in ways that are divisive and untrue. And we see it in all kinds of other ways. And I think, what was mentioned earlier is that the systemic racism that leads to the demographics that I described and leads to the discourse that I talk about are all prevalent here. But, I wouldn't want to leave this without talking about some of the origins. I can't help but think about what was described in terms of hyper-surveillance, in terms of tracking, in terms of the pushing for maximum productivity and thinking about how each person needs to produce X number of whatever, and think about how closely that aligns with one of the original sins in this country around slavery, and the injustice, the ultimate injustice that was associated with the bondage and slavery of Black bodies as it relates to capitalism and taking advantage of workforce. All of that is in the mix when we think about worker justice. And I think it's important for us to recognize it and recognize the agency that's going to be required on the part of people who are most impacted by this to get out of it. The second thing is just talking a little bit about challenges. And I want to run through this quickly, but I think it's really important to mention philanthropy often gets caught up in what I think is a false dichotomy around services and safety net versus systems change and policy. And while it's a false dichotomy, the part that is true is that most in philanthropy are used to working in the space that is really about safety net, about services, about programs. And we've got to figure out what the right dose is of that, which is really important. It's important. We saw it during COVID and we have to meet those needs, but it also has to be coupled with getting upstream and thinking about the systems and policies that got us here. And I think that if we aren't in balance with those things, we don't really end up supporting the kinds of things that need to be supported in order to be responsive to a report like this. Those of us in philanthropy are much more familiar with that approach around kind of services and programs, which means that there's less familiarity and comfort with the kind of support for organizing and advocacy that is necessary for systems and policy change. So one of the things that we have to do as a field is get much more comfortable and much more into the space of supporting that kind of advocacy and support that leads to the kind of power shifts that are going to be needed in order to be responsive here. A few pieces of advice for funding colleagues that are on this call and those who aren't, who are thinking about this work. One is that if this is systemic work, we got to get to know systems. And in order to get to know systems, you got to get to know and get comfortable with government. I think too many of us fool ourselves into thinking that philanthropy can change the tone and tenor in these issues without engaging local government. And the reality is that we're fooling ourselves if we think that's true. That being the case, in order for these systems and policies to move, we've got to, like I said, be much more comfortable with the kind of organizing and advocacy work that moves systems and support and listen to movement leaders that are in this work to inform the strategies that get us there as well. Last thing I would mention here in terms of advice is, it's been said several times, but it's worth repeating. We've got to center the folks who are most impacted by this situation if we have any opportunity or hope of being able to address these systems. And that really leads me to the last point, which is in this moment. I think that we have all over the last year heard about, as we think about the economic impacts of our response to the pandemic, that we have to return, but we have to return in a way that is built back better than what we entered into. All of the things that we are describing were conditions that existed before the pandemic. I would argue got worse during the pandemic. So as we come out of it, we have to think about how we have an equitable recovery that is really about a new normal, not going back to normal. In order for that to happen, again, we have to center the folks most impacted. We saw when the a vaccine was rolled out, the best of intentions around the rollout that would be equitable. But when it actually happened, the intentions not meeting the work. That's going to happen again if we don't center the folks that need to be centered when we're thinking about the economic recovery. So I'll end it there. Again, welcome to be very happy to be a part of this, excited about this report. Kung, I'll turn it back over to you.
Hey, Fred, thanks for dropping that wisdom for us. Really appreciate it. I think so much of our work and are looking at the question of equity front and center, both racial and economic, really does derive from some of the leadership of SF Foundation and the organizations in that constellation that we work together with. So 100% on that. I really feel you. And now is actually a moment for all of us to share our aha moments. Like, that moment really spoke to me. That was a moment of realization. I know there was a lot of things that were dropped by Shahryar, Yesenia, Fred, and Tim. So we have a fun way for you to kick back and share some of those insights as well from the audience. This is your chance. Take a look at the links in the descriptions. We have something called the Mentimeter, where you can log on to that. So there you go, Mentimeter. Just go to that website and type in your code, and that's where you can give feedback. The question for us is, what was your aha moment? I want to hear what you thought of that sparked your attention, that grabbed your eyes, that grabbed your heart. I feel like there was a few mentions, like Tim said this quote was like, high road is this political moment. And I really do feel that. And I think it helped me focus. I was like, what are we doing in the high road training partnerships? What can we do in that field? That is the moment that is right. And that speaks to what Fred is talking about building back better, about not having the normal that we knew, right? Not just returning to that, but something different. And which is what we're talking about in this webinar, the future of work. So go ahead, go to Menti, pop in the code, and then share with everybody else what was your aha moment during this webinar. We also had a question from another person on the chat, and I want to bring up Luis, who can address that question.
Thanks, Kung. So we had actually a few questions since we're talking about money and how do we bend money towards improving equity about the state budget. And first and foremost, I want to say the state budget is still being debated and decided right now. So if you have a priority, if this has sparked something, if you see something that you think should be in the state budget or that it should be using a certain lens, now is the time. Talk to your assembly members, talk to your state members, advocate for what it is you want. It's nothing is set in stone. The two specific questions I saw, one was, is there workforce development funding for worker organizing? And there is a coalition called the California Coalition for Worker Power, and I believe several other organizations that we're a part of that is advocating for very much that, for additional workforce development funding that can explicitly be used for know your rights training, for workers to understand what are the rights that you have in the workplace, how do you exercise those rights, how do you support your coworkers to exercise them, how do you make the workplace a safe and respectful and empowering place. So if you think that is something you would like to see, I'd encourage you to go talk to your state representatives and make it happen. The second question was about support for worker ownership in the state budget. I believe that is also something that there are groups advocating for right now. There's certainly quite a lot of funding proposed for small businesses, and I think it's an open question of how and whether that could be used to support transitions to worker ownership. So these are great questions and great ideas, and now is the time to try to take those ideas and turn them into reality.
All right, y'all, let's see what we got on Menti. Don't be shy. We want to hear from you. There's been so much good input here. I see philanthropy without local government for true system change. I know that Fred was speaking to that, really pushing us on how do we engage for system change. Workers as decision makers. Yes, amen to that. Wow, yeah, go deep, right? Technologicalization of industries and slavery, you know. The report speaks to that, Fred speaks to that. Some of the fundamental economic development of this country is based on slavery, right? So, you know, racial capitalism is this system. The nudge for philanthropy to get comfortable with government. I hear another echo of that. Seemed like it was a real point. Getting upstream, influencing root causes, right? That's kind of why we had that image of the tree, right? We see the surface, we see the leaves, but we got to get down to the trunk. We got to get down underground. We got to reach into the roots. Another person mentioned the story. I know through the course of these interviews, through the course of our work, there's just some really powerful stories, right? Offering a sandwich instead of a sick day. Yeah. Another one, false dichotomy between direct services versus systems change. Big ups to Fred here on speaking to that, the false dichotomy. How do we move forward on both fronts? How do we get upstream, like he said, on systems change? Really appreciate you all. This is not your last moment, right? If you're feeling shy, this is not your last moment to have some input, to join this conversation. I'm going to bring in Rob, and also props to Rob. You know, this idea sort of for this project started with you, and I feel like it's a moment to hand it off to you to wrap us up.
Thanks, Kung. And I just want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers today, the project team, all of the leaders who were interviewed for the report, our partners at the Humanity Communications Collective for all your technical support, and all of you for joining us today for this.
Hey, I think Rob might have frozen, at least for me. But, you know, many thanks to all the folks who put together this report. Obviously, ReWork and all the people involved in ReWork who helped support us through this process. I want to bring up this screen. There's a way for you to take a survey. Let us know more what you thought, how you could, you know, put into practice some of the things that you heard. And we also have this really beautiful survey poster, special edition. If you want to see that, Power as at Root, a really, really gorgeous work of art by an artist, local artist, Fernando Martí, who is a housing justice activist, really rooted in our movements. And, you know, he had this insight. You see here, the future of work that we want to belong to, this visionary future. And here we are planting, tilling, tending to this, and really growing this visionary future of work. So we want you to be part of that. We want you to be part of this project. We want this project to keep up and grow. So take our survey. Let us know how you can keep up this work, how you can join us. And for those who take our survey, we'll send you a poster to remember this and to be part of this. Thank you all so much. Yeah, does the rest of the team want to join us and as we sign off? Luis, Davida, Kayla, Rob. All right. Thanks, y'all. Thanks for joining us.